It's really wonderful to be here. To be here with all of you, to be especially here with Quentin Young and his remarkable career of activism, fighting for all of us. And to be back in Washington State, in Seattle. I was here in November of 2009. It was right around Thanksgiving. And my last book had just come out. It's the book of columns that used to appear in the Seattle Times. And I hope, I mean, they've always been great supporters, and I really do hope that they'll have us back in the newspaper. And I write the columns with Dennis, and since the book had just come out, we were here, I was speaking, we did a big event, believe it or not, at SeaTac. It was Thanksgiving time at the airport. As people were running back and forth, it was a great chance to meet people and talk to people about ideas and where they were going. I met one nurse from Bellingham who was a nurse in the Vietnam War, and for the first time in decades, she was returning to see what had happened in Vietnam. I met a farmer who was fighting in genetically modified crops, and it was really a remarkable time. It was also the time that Sarah Palin's book had come out, remember? Going Rogue. And so my book was on one side of the bookstore, and her book was on the other, and a book website was calling up to see who was winning in terms of selling books. And people were coming through, and I was signing books, and finally they called, and I said, you know, we've sold, I don't know how many books at that moment. We'd been there for about an hour, and I said, I think it's 25-0 right now. I said, Going Rogue is going nowhere. Whereupon we then headed up to Canada. Since people were celebrating Thanksgiving in this country, we thought we would go to Canada, where they weren't eating turkey to talk turkey. And I was going to give a speech at the Vancouver Public Library to support the community radio stations there. It was a big fundraiser. And speaking of community radio, I hope all of you support KBCS. It is such an important station, and they're really hitting a milestone right now because they are able to reach 1 million more listeners if they elevate their transmitter and put it on top of a mountain. It's now at next to the station in a parking lot, and they need $160,000 to do this. They've raised over $100,000, and so soon, even in Seattle, you'll be able to hear them. And they'll have a stronger signal, and I hope you all support KBCS. They're going into fundraising next week, because community radio, Pacifica Radio, independent media, public radio, and public television are where it's at. I think the media are the most powerful institutions on earth, can be the greatest force for peace on earth when they're not being used to beat the drums for war. And independent media, not brought to you by the weapons manufacturers, by the oil, gas, and coal companies, not brought to you by big pharma and the insurance industry, has the greatest possibility to provide a forum for authentic discussion and debate that will lead to the most just society we can achieve in this country. So we were headed to Canada, and I just met some folks from Spain who live in Vancouver who came down for this event tonight. Well, we were headed up there, and we came to the border. We were just driving up. It was raining hard, and they took our passports and they flagged us over and said we had to go into the, customs, into the big border facility there. We walked in and they called me up to the counter and they said, "We want your notes on what you're going to be talking about tonight." And I said, "You're kidding." I said, "We already gave you our passports." They said, "I want your notes." The customs officer said, fully armed, "I want your notes." So this is the thing. I don't really speak from notes. And I said, "Just 1 minute, please." So I ran out to the car and I got the book and I brought it in and I gave them a copy. And one of them was typing in a computer. Another of the customs agents started to read the book, which I thought was a good thing. And they said, "What are you talking about tonight?" I said, "Well, this is the thing. I sort of riff from columns in the book. And you really could come to the talk tonight because it's an open talk. I wasn't planning to give it on the border, but he said, "I need to know what you're talking about." So I said, "Well, I thought I would start with the last column in the book." It says, "Imagine the scene. America, 2009. 45,000 people have died in a year, an average of almost more than 120 a day. Who's taking them out? What's killing them?" To investigate, President Obama might be tempted to call on Jack Bauer, the fictional rogue intelligence agent from the hit TV series 24, who invariably employs torture and a host of other illegal tactics to help the president fight terrorism. But terrorism is not the culprit here. It's lack of adequate health care. So maybe the president's solution isn't Jack Bauer, but rather the actor who plays him. The star of 24 is played by Kiefer Sutherland, whose family has very deep connections to healthcare reform in Canada. Sutherland is the grandson of the late Tommy Douglas. I just told Congressman McDermott this. He wasn't aware, and he just told you the story of Tommy Douglas, the pioneering Canadian politician credited with creating the modern Canadian healthcare system. As a youth, Tommy Douglas almost lost his ailing leg. His family could not afford treatment, but a doctor treated him for free, provided his medical students could observe. As an adult, Douglas saw the impact of widespread poverty caused by the Great Depression. Trained as a minister, he had a popular oratorical style. He moved into politics, joining the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation Party. After several years in Parliament, he led the party's decisive victory in the province of Saskatchewan, ushering in the first social democratic government in North America. Douglas became Premier of Saskatchewan and pioneered a number of progressive policies, but his biggest battle, for which he is best remembered, is the creation of universal health insurance called Medicare. It passed in Saskatchewan in 1962, guaranteeing hospital care for all residents. Doctors there staged a 23-day strike supported by the US-based American Medical Association. Despite industry opposition, the Saskatchewan Medicare program was so successful and popular it was adopted throughout Canada. While Tommy Douglas was fighting for health insurance in Canada, a similar battle was raging in the US, resulting in the passage of Medicare and Medicaid, giving guaranteed single-payer health care to senior citizens and the poor. I didn't plan to read the book to the border agents, but they were waiting for more. So I talked about someone who's again gotten attention, especially in these last few days, Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh, Fox News Channel's Glenn Beck, and insurance industry-funded groups have encouraged people to disrupt town hall meetings. This was leading up to with members of Congress, a number of confrontations you might remember around the country. This was in 2011. Rush Limbaugh said 24 was one of his favorite shows. He even visited the set. Well, he should learn from the real-life actor who plays his hero, Jack. Limbaugh and his cohorts might find truth not as satisfying as fiction. In 2004, a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation poll named Tommy Douglas the greatest Canadian. At a protest in 2000 against efforts to roll back the Medicare system in the province of Alberta, Kiefer Sutherland defended Canada's public single-payer system. He said private health care does not work. America's trying to change their system. It's too expensive to get comprehensive medical care in the U.S. Why on earth are we going to follow their system here? Kiefer Sutherland went on to say, I consider it a humanitarian issue. This is an issue about what is right and wrong, what is decent and what is not. Maybe Jack Bauer can save the day. And the Canadian Border Guard said, what else are you going to talk about tonight? So I said, you know, you're stopping me at the border, you're detaining me, and I've come to applaud your healthcare system. Sarah Palin has been trashing it. Why did you let her just come freely? What else are you talking about? Okay, I was going to talk about poverty. What else? And then I thought maybe this is what he's getting at. I was going to talk about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What else are you talking about, he said. I said I was going to talk about, you know, the economic crisis. He said, what else? I said, it's not that long a talk. That pretty much covers it. And he says, are you denying right here, right now, that you're going to be talking, that you're not going to talk about the Vancouver Olympics? About the Olympics, he said, not the Vancouver Olympics. And I thought he meant President Obama. Well, I said to him, you mean President Obama going to Copenhagen to try to get the Olympics in Chicago? And he said, and you didn't get them. I said, I know we didn't get them. And I said, are you talking about the, and he said, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Vancouver Olympics. This was right before the Vancouver Olympics. I actually didn't even know the Olympics were going to be taking place in Vancouver, which was even more insulting and made him think that I was not telling the truth. And I said, well, I wasn't planning to talk about them until now. So they went out to our car. I was traveling with two Democracy Now! Folks, and they went through everything in our car, combing through our notes. When I went out to check on them, they had our computers open, and they were going through the computers. They told me to get back inside. When they came back in, they took me into a back room. They took photographs of me and of my colleagues, and then they stamped what they called travel documents in our passports that said we had to leave Canada within 48 hours. So we headed to the Vancouver Public Library. We were about an hour late to the talk, but thank God for Canadians. They went out for beer and they came back double the size of the audience, telling their friends to come as well. And I talked mainly about the Vancouver Olympics, something I had not been, or asking them what was so significant. And then we headed to the University of Victoria, where I had been invited to speak the next night, and we're staying at a bed and breakfast. And I got there right around 6 o'clock when their news was showing at night, right before the talk. And I walked in, and everyone in the bed and breakfast was having tea before dinner. And so I took a little teacup and some tea, and they turned on the news, and the top story was me getting detained at the border. And everyone turned and looked and said, "Is that you?" And they had made this an issue, and I learned from the following stories after the report of detaining a U.S. journalist, and that was that as the Vancouver Olympics were about to begin, they'd passed legislation that athletes were not allowed to criticize the corporations that were sponsoring the Olympics. You couldn't have a sign in your house against the Olympics, or they could enter the house. There was a real crackdown on free speech. And so when we came back to New York the next day, over the weekend, we devoted our broadcast to the Vancouver Olympics. Now, never let it be said that the state determines what we do, but this kind of crackdown on speech on behalf of corporations is of grave concern, and we're seeing it more and more. But I mentioned Rush Limbaugh, and it is so important to talk about what is happening today. You may have heard in the last few days what happened, well, it started a few weeks ago when there was a congressional hearing where they were going to be talking about birth control. And the hearing did not have one woman on the panel. My congressman, one of our Congress members in New York, Carolyn Maloney, was so enraged. She was on this committee. She said, here we are talking about birth control. She said, where are the women? I don't see a single woman representing the tens of millions of women across this country who want and need insurance coverage. And women Congress members walked out of the hearing. There had been a woman who was supposed to testify. She was 30 years old. She's a law student at Georgetown, a Jesuit university in Washington, D.C. Her name is Sandra Fluck, and her name is becoming a household word because she was prevented from testifying. She came on Democracy Now! It was the first national radio she did, the next show she did the next morning. And she talked about what she had planned to testify about there, about how important it was for women to be able to have access to preventative medicine, and that is birth control. She was representing many women at Georgetown, and she was talking about one in particular who was 27 years old, a friend of hers, who suffered from polycystic ovarian syndrome. And the reason she needed the pill was to control the syndrome. And because she wasn't able to get access to it, she had to have an ovary removed and then went into premature menopause. It is not only used for contraception, though she was speaking out for women having access to birth control as contraception as well, and said we have that right. As a result of her daring to speak out, whether you agree with her or not, and saying that Catholic institutions, Catholic universities and Catholic hospitals, where most of the staff are not Catholic, should have to provide insurance. Insurance companies should provide for birth control just as they do for any other institution. Even though most people who work for those institutions, millions of them, by the way, this isn't a requirement of parishes, but this is a requirement of universities and hospitals. Even though most of the people who work there are not Catholic, 98% of Catholic women have used birth control. So this is really for everyone. As a result of what she attempted to say, Rush Limbaugh has made her the target of his venom and wrath. And you may have heard what he said over the last few days, calling her a slut and a prostitute, this young woman who wanted to testify before Congress, calling her a slut and a prostitute, saying that, and asking the question, why should the American taxpayer have to pay for every one of her sex acts? And he said, if we do have to, she should have to post videos of having sex on the internet. As a result, President Obama called Sandra Fluck to congratulate her for being so brave and speaking out, and told her to tell her parents that they should be very proud of her. To which Rush Limbaugh responded, he hasn't backed off, he has just become more fierce every day. You are telling a 30-year-old woman that she should tell her parents to be proud. Last night, O'Reilly went on the air to support Rush Limbaugh. Now, what has happened over these last few days has also been amazing. The reaction of people across the political spectrum, pro-choice, anti-choice, whatever your view is, but the kind of insults that have been hurled at this young woman. And so people have organized a boycott, putting pressure on his advertisers in the same way that they put pressure on Don Imus after Don Imus insulted the Rutgers University basketball team, the women's basketball team, which forced him off the air. This boycott of Rush Limbaugh has been extremely successful in just a matter of hours. And so now I hear that someone just said,
he apologized after the sponsors
started to pull out one by one.
after he pulled out, he apologized.
So this is news to me today. So after this this is happening so fast. I think he has been shocked, and money talks. And so what will happen to him, we will see. But all I could think is, when we're talking about issues of single payer or just health care for everyone in this country, you never know when the magic moment will come. I mean, you have people like Dr. Quentin Young and PNHP and advocates for decades who've been working on a kind of Medicare for all system in this country. You never know what will be the tipping point. But if you're involved with activism on any issue, you will be a part of making history when that moment comes. And it's often a moment you cannot predict. And I think this moment of this young woman speaking out could be one of them, because it infuriated so many people in all the different parties, and there are more than two, and more than two can really make a difference in this country. People of every political persuasion and of every generation who were just horrified at the insults that were being hurled. You know, it makes me think of Rosa Parks. And I think it's very instructive to go back to this moment. You've heard some incredibly good speeches today on the healthcare system. They are the experts. I mean, Teresa and Dr. Quentin Young and Jim and all the folks who are speaking to you tonight. And I'm not an expert on healthcare. But covering movements, I think it's very important to see how strategy works. I mean, Rosa Parks, the story that is not told about her, you know, when she died a few years ago, Democracy Now! Raced down to Washington to cover the big memorial service for her before she was buried, the big funeral in Detroit. And when the media told her story again, they said that she was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. But that was not true. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. I don't know if we can call Quentin Young the Rosa Parks of the healthcare movement, but Rosa Parks knew exactly what she was doing on December 1st, 1955. When she sat down in the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refused to get up when a bus driver told her to get up for a white passenger. You know, she was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon, who was the president, and he had worked with one of the greatest organizers of the 20th century, with A. Philip Randolph, as they organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Very relevant in Washington state, because the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters were the African-American porters in the Pullman trains, named, you know, Pullman, named for George Pullman. You have Pullman, Washington. And the conductors were all called George. It's not that their mothers had all named them George, but that's what they were called, to give you a sense of just that level of racism, not to mention what they were subjected to. But they brought in A. Philip Randolph to organize them, and then A. Philip Randolph went on to organize the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And E.D. Nixon worked with him. He came out of radical labor politics, and he worked with Rosa Parks as they tried to most effectively challenge the racist laws of the South. She had trained at the Highlander Center, where Dr. King had been also, white and black together, as they most strategically worked to, it wasn't just enough to say we're against this and they wanted to figure out how to accomplish the challenging of, for example, the laws integrating the transportation system. And so when she sat down on that bus, she knew just what she was doing. Now, she had sat down on the bus before and refused to get up for a white passenger. In fact, other young women had done the same. But you never know when that magic moment will come. But if you're working for social change, you will be a part of determining the future. 4 days later, on December 5th, 1955, after she sat down and got arrested, she was in court, and the Montgomery Improvement Association had their meeting to elect a leader to lead the bus boycott that would lead to the integration of the transportation system of this country. And they elected a young minister who had just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks had helped to launched the modern-day civil rights movement and helped launch Dr. Martin Luther King into the public eye and to what we all know happened after that. It is amazing what she accomplished. And to show how brave she was, just go back a few months to the summer of 1955. That was the summer of Emmett Till. That was the summer that this 14-year-old African-American boy who lived in Chicago with his mother, Mamie. She sent him to Money, Mississippi to be with relatives for the summer to get out of the city. And he was at home sleeping with his aunt and uncle and cousins when a white mob came into the house. They ripped him out of bed, they tortured him, they beat him, and he ended up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. When his body was dredged up and sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie, did something incredibly courageous. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands walked by his casket and saw his distended, mutilated head. And then Jet magazine and other black publications took photographs, and they were published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had a real lesson to teach the press of today. Show the pictures, show the images. And that's what we need the press to do. When we talk about issues that are of concern to everyone, like the national debt, we just had David K. Johnston, the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter, now works for Reuters, on talking about Mitt Romney's tax plan. There is a connection here. Mitt Romney's tax plan, saying, the tax plan he's put forward would increase taxes on the poorest 125 million Americans, but decrease the taxes for the 0.1% at the top by something like, more than $460,000 a year. And he was talking all about this and about Mitt Romney's offshore, accounts in the Cayman Islands, not only his own personal ones, but also Bain. And he ended up the discussion, though, by saying, if we are concerned about the national debt in this country, the number one issue that we have got to deal with is health care. Simple as that, he said, is health care. And that is something that Republicans and Democrats can unite on. If the media actually shows this and tells us the stories of people all across this country, like Michael in the audience who just came up to me, 25 years old, where are you, who is dealing, there you are, is waving his hand, has a cast on his arm, doesn't have insurance, dealing with second stage cancer, hoping to conquer it so that he can go on to get his PhD in political science at Santa Cruz, and we all wish you the very best. But showing those stories, telling those stories every single day. I've always believed if the media puts these stories front and center, the stories of people, you know, fighting for health care, like you might have heard our story just a few weeks ago with Elizabeth Benjamin, who's vice president of the Community Service Society in New York, and Hope Rubel, who, how did the Times describe Hope? They didn't say that she was a Democracy Now! Viewer, but she is. But they said, Nina Bernstein wrote a very good piece. This is about New York, but I think it could be about all of the United States. For most of her life, Hope Rubel was a healthy woman with good medical insurance, an unblemished credit history, and a solid career in graphic design. But on the day an ambulance rushed her to a Manhattan hospital emergency room shortly after her 48th birthday, she was jobless, uninsured, and having a stroke. Ms. Rubel's medical problem was rare, a result of a benign tumor on her adrenal gland, but the financial consequences were not unusual. She depleted her savings to pay $17,000 for surgery to remove the tumor and then watched, emotionally paralyzed, she said, as $88,000 in additional hospital bills poured in. Eventually, the hospital sued her for the money. Yet that year, the hospital, New York Presbyterian, Weill Cornell, had already collected $50.2 million from New York State's so-called indigent care pool to help care for people like Ms. Rubel, who have no insurance and cannot pay their bills. This is New York's story. New York's charity care system, partly financed by a 8.95% surcharge on hospital bills, is one of the most complicated in the nation. Like New York, several passed laws curbing hospitals' pursuit of unpaid bills, including Illinois, California, and Minnesota. But this new study by Elizabeth Benjamin at the Community Service Society, who we had on with Hope, a study of New York's hospitals' practices and state records finds that most medical centers are violating the rules without consequences, even as the state government ignores glaring problems in the hospital's own reports. The hospitals have gotten something like $460 million to pay for people like Hope. You know, if you go into the hospital and you're brought into a hospital, sometimes you're not conscious, you're not deciding what hospital you're brought into. You're uninsured. The hospital then, you know, duns you for money, tries to get money from you. You say, I don't know what to do. In 2/3 of the hospitals in New York State, they don't tell you that they have this indigent care program. They don't tell you, they don't give you a financial form that says lay out what your finances are, because they, overall the system, they get something like $1.2 billion from the state. But they don't tell you this. Sometimes they put your debt into collections. They give it over to a state collector. They sell your debt. And then they get money for this. And then that gets you a lien on your home, for example, if you own a home. Here you are at your sickest, and you are now destitute, that you have a lien on your house. This is a system that I deeply believe Americans across the political spectrum would not stand for if they understood what their neighbors, and so often they themselves, are going through, how often this happens in this country. And it's our job in the media and your job as media consumers to demand that these stories get told every single day. I put this... I put this war on not only the poor, because we are talking, I mean, in Colorado, 60% of the state's uninsured have jobs. 60% of the state's uninsured have jobs. We're talking not only about the media dealing with life and death issues of the wars abroad, which we must look at, but the war at home. I've always said that if for 1 week all of us and all of the media we run and consume, right, people have their own Facebook pages, we read the newspaper, we go online. If on every Facebook wall, if on the front page of every surviving newspaper in this country, we showed the images of war, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? The babies dead on the ground, the soldiers dead and dying, the women with their legs blown off in drone attacks. For just 1 week, if it was the top of every TV and radio newscast, every tweet that you sent out dealt with war in one of these stories. I think Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. I also think that if we did the same thing with the war on the poor at home, and also not only the poor, but the lack of health care in this country, if we made it the topic of everything we did for just 1 week, American people would unite and say, we have to solve this issue. I think that's why the Occupy movement has been so broadly supported in the United States, despite the fact that the corporate media first ignored it, then ridiculed it. It is amazing to think how much support it has gotten, because it is tapping a basic American sentiment, and it is about justice, and it's about a revulsion about inequality. You know the Gandhian phrase, you know, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. That's really a description of what happened in the media. You remember what happened when the first encampment began September 17th in New York, Occupy Wall Street. So Democracy Now! Was the only national media outlet that covered it even before September 17th, because we cover movements. And we saw this was coming, and our reporters were at the meetings and were covering this. Then it took weeks for the media to cover. First they ignored it, and then they started to attack it viciously. I remember watching, it was MSNBC in the morning, and they were saying if these people had something important to say, they'd have a spokesperson right here. The problem is they have to be invited in, right? And they said, what on earth are they saying? They have no message. What could be a more powerful message than we are the 99%? It is something. I generally don't drink bottled water, but what could be more compelling than we are the 99%? And I also think in terms of sentiment, a number of those in the 1% identify with that statement as well. What has happened in this country is remarkable, and it followed Wisconsin, which followed Egypt, which followed Tunisia. We have seen something the likes of which we haven't seen in the world in this last year. I mean, starting with Tunisia, this utterly frustrated young man came out of the university named Mohamed Bouazizi, whose only job he could find was in the fruit and vegetable marketplace, selling fruit and vegetable. And the authorities started to go after him and harass him, and he was so utterly frustrated when they took his scale away from him that he set himself on fire. And that was the spark that ignited the Tunisian revolution, that then went on to spark the Egyptian revolution. There were other things as well, like WikiLeaks. And we cannot underestimate the power of information when it is made available to us. You know, when the WikiLeaks documents came out, the Afghan war logs, the Iraq diaries, the State Department cables that have come out, people in Tunisia saw that, I mean, they knew that their tyrant, that their dictator was corrupt, but they saw that the US understood that as well and continued to support him. And this just infuriated them further. And then you move on to Egypt, and what took place there, I mean, maybe many of you lived it each day because of the remarkable reporting of Sharif Abdel-Quddus, Democracy Now!'s correspondent on the ground. Sharif, who just won the Izzy Award from the Park Center for Independent Journalism, named for I.F. Stone. I.F. Stone, who famously said to students, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie, in terms of doing good journalism. But there was Sharif, who flew back home. He's an Egyptian American who flew home as he was getting tweets and texts from home, from people who are not political, from his cousins, from family members, from friends, saying, I will die for this revolution. And he knew he had to be in the place which he said he both loved and was ashamed of all of his life. And he flew home, and even as he came through the airport and basically landed in Tahrir, he said, this will never be Mubarak's Egypt again. And the revolution began. Because Democracy Now! Has always been very creative, not having the financial resources of the networks. When they send, you know, during Saddam Hussein's Iraq, when he had a firewall up, they were giving him millions of dollars to send on his satellites their video. Democracy Now! And Jeremy Scahill was in Iraq reporting for us during Saddam Hussein's time. He and Jackie Sewin of Big Noise Films were going into internet cafes. They would have video reports that they would send through 150 emails, you know, broken apart, using a computer program. We would piece it back together on our end and run it. So when Mubarak took down the internet in Egypt, Sharif had a way to get around it, and he became one of the top tweeters in the world. He had a joke, Sharif. He said that, you know, Mubarak's downfall was taking down the internet. He said, because after all, we're Egyptian. We were all home. You're tweeting. You're on Facebook. He says, you're on the internet. And then he took down the internet, Mubarak did. And so we all had to go outside and see what was going on. So, Tahrir just happens, and young people, older people, whole families. The internet then went back up, but the thugs went after the satellites. So you had people like Anderson Cooper of CNN in his hotel room, and he would be looking like Democracy Now! On Skype, and it would be saying, the lower third would be saying, reporting from an undisclosed location. And there was Sharif naming himself in the middle of Tahrir, saying, I'm in the safest place in Egypt. And he was reporting for all the networks, and the networks were reporting, showing his tweets. CNN was showing what he was saying each day as he was bringing out the voices of people in Tahrir. And through him, you met Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old doctor who ran for president, who was imprisoned under Sadat, who was in exile under Mubarak, this remarkable woman who had run for president in Egypt. You met Hadef Souef, the great writer who wrote Map of Love, as she described leaving Tahrir, and when they heard Mubarak fell, she had been with 2 very pregnant women, and she said now they can give birth in freedom. You met the young high school student who was putting out these broadsheet Voices of Tahrir in the shadow of the state media building that had controlled the images for so long. You met people that could have been your aunt, your uncle, your mother, your father. He made it personal. He made this world revolution as if it could be happening in your own family. and he introduced you. This is the power of grassroots media, is showing the way grassroots action happens through everyday people, this extraordinary event. And that's the gift that Sharif gave us, to working with Hani Massoud, another of our producers who had been on the Egyptian basketball team, who was leaping buildings in a single bound as he had his video camera, and as Sharif would stay there all night. Sharif is the grandson of the most famous writer in Egypt, Hassan Abdel Qaddus. And any Egyptian here will certainly know his name. He's sort of considered like the Mark Twain of Egypt. And his great-grandmother is Rosal Youssef, who's a great feminist who founded a magazine by that name, Rosal Youssef, which exists today. And there he was translating what was happening in his country for all of us. That was Egypt, and then there was Libya, and now there is the agony of Syria, which we continue to have to deal with, and the world must deal with when you have a crisis like this with the thousands of people being killed. And that cannot be separated from how the U.S. is dealing with Iran right now. Is there no memory? I mean, does this remind you of 2002 and 2003? Weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, when in fact he did not. In Iran, you know, they are getting a nuclear weapon, when if you listen to the most belligerent country in dealing with Iran, Israel, that continually is threatening to bomb Iran, their own heads of Mossad have said they will not be getting a nuclear weapon for years. And yet, we continue to say this, as if when pulling out of Afghanistan, that we cannot pull out soon enough, and pulling out of Iraq, we must have some country that we are attacking. We need to attack the serious problems right here at home, like healthcare. And we need to have a space in this country where people can express dissent. That's what the Occupy movement has been about. And I think we can learn from right here in Seattle, which was really, I think, the birthplace of the Occupy movement when you go back to 1999 and the Battle of Seattle. Taking on these corporate powers, it was incredible to be there. It was the first time Democracy Now! Was doing radio and television, was back in 1999, for this incredible week. You know, we came in force to Seattle because we saw how all the movements were converging at this remarkable moment at the end of November in 1999. And I co-host Democracy Now! With Juan Gonzalez, a great reporter, who also writes columns, and I hope you all read his book, News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race in the American Media. He wrote it with Joe Torres. But Juan writes for the New York Daily News, the largest New York paper. He's a columnist, and he has for many, many years. Now, when Democracy Now! Headed to Seattle in 1999, we said to Juan, will you come? And he said, okay, let me ask my editors at the Daily News. And he said to them he wanted to cover this movement that was going to take place, this protest against the WTO. And they said, the who? And they said, the WTO. And they said, how does that affect us in New York? We absolutely saw no reason why you should be able to go there. So that was the giant. Democracy Now! Was the ant, but we brought Juan with us, and though the Daily News didn't want him to go. And so he came to Seattle, and to say the least, all hell broke loose, or you might say all heaven broke loose. But suddenly, Juan is getting calls from the Daily News to do daily updates and then hourly updates, and that they could say they had their man from the beginning on the scene. But this incredible movement here in Seattle of thousands of people, high school kids, environmentalists, unionists, doctors, nurses, farmers from all over the world, recognizing what it meant to have unbridled corporate power determining, even overturning the rules of states and countries, recognizing the danger of this unbridled corporate power. This began back in 1999, and it's also really instructive to see the tremendous police repression that everyone was faced with. The tear gas, the rubber bullets that were being denied by the city authorities here, and so CNN was simply parroting that line where indie media was getting more hits on their website, telling the truth, showing the pictures, the handfuls of the rubber bullets that were being held. They were getting more hits than CNN on their website, and indie media was really born here. And then you have, Norm Stamper, who was forced to step down, who feels that what he did here was his greatest mistake. And he has become an eloquent spokesperson now. The police chief of Seattle, the former police chief who presided over this, one who knows, against the militarization of police in this country. We have had him on several times, and we most recently had him on when we had a spokesperson for the Police Foundation who had coordinated a call between police chiefs around the country on how to basically stamp out Occupy, how to deal with the Occupy movement, how to shut it down. And when the guest came on with Norm Stamper, he said, "Norm, we want to congratulate you." First of all, he came on because Chief Stamper was going to be on. And he said, "We want to congratulate you. You're really the model of how we see we should deal with these encampments around the country." And Norm was saying, no, I do not want to be the model. I should be the model for the opposite because I think what we did was wrong. And how significant this is, and this profound point he made, beyond the using of the rubber bullets and the tear gas, when you have this militarized force in their riot gear with their shields, the police set up a wall between them and these peaceful protesters that is very frightening. What happens when you create such a gulf, when you don't see people anymore as your neighbors, as your kids, as your friends, as your kids' friends, that suddenly you see them as the enemy. I have this theory that, the Pax Comitatus Act in the United States, which says that the military can't walk through the streets of the United States, that the way we are getting around this is by the militarization of the police. And this is an enormous problem when they are getting more than $1 billion and they are getting tanks and drones, the police departments of this country. We dealt with a level of this at the Republican and Democratic conventions. And I think this is important even in having a discussion about health care, because health care is a part of this movement of resistance in this country that is having an expression like we have never seen. And who knows what will happen in the spring. Movements don't usually begin in the fall. This one did, and then it met the coldness of winter and the militarization of the police. But there is a spring to come, and it is converging on... It is converging together with an election year when all people are particularly attuned to politics. This is a moment when politicians listen. They have to. Yes, they need money, and they take a lot of it, but they also, in the end, need votes. And so there is this moment when your demands truly do make a difference. Don't forget that President Obama was a community organizer, right? Okay, the community organizer-in-chief became the commander-in-chief, and the question is now, how do you community organize? And what happens when the person that possibly many of you voted for, you disagree with? How do you express your point of view, especially at a time when you see, I think this is what happened in 2008. all movements converged. I think the main difference between Obama and Clinton in the Democratic primary was simply that he had been against the war in Iraq. That was the main difference between the two. And she refused until the end, until it was too late, to say she made a mistake in supporting the war in Iraq. And so here was President Obama swept in by the anti-war movement as well as a number of other movements, with people having tremendous expectations of him. I think the day he was elected, the world heaved a sigh of relief, right? I mean, so many people felt they had been hitting their heads against a brick wall, and suddenly that wall became a door. But the question is, would it be kicked open or would it be slammed shut? Right? When he is in the Oval Office, and those who are used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth whisper in his ear, if he can't point out the window of the Oval Office and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille, if he doesn't see anyone out there, he is in big trouble. And that's when he agrees with you. And what about when you disagree with him? Well, there's no more important time to express those views than now. I mean, the great Harry Belafonte, whose life is the story of resistance in the 20th century, the great artist, singer, actor, and activist, you know, part of all the great movements of the 20th century, and particularly the civil rights movement, told me about the time when Eleanor Roosevelt told him, could you imagine, that there is someone who's saying, when Eleanor told me, told him about bringing A. Philip Randolph to the White House and meeting with FDR, her husband. She brought that meeting together, and A. Philip Randolph told FDR about the condition of black people in this country, of working people in this country, and FDR responded to him, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but you're going to have to make me do it. Make me do it. You've heard that story. Well, when Senator Obama was running for president, and he was in the backyard of a New Jersey house with about 100 people, and they were asking him questions, he was about to leave, and a guy in the back raised his hand and said, what are you going to do about the Middle East? And Obama told the story of A. Philip Randolph meeting with FDR, ending with, make me do it, make me do it. That's really the challenge to all of you and all the different issues you care about right now. There is a moment right now, and you have to decide whether you're going to do something about it or let it slip away. And I think one of the fundamental issues now are this issue of corporate control. It's an issue that unites people across the political spectrum. I mean, at Occupy, they had the most fantastic signs, you know, written on the back of pizza boxes, because pizza parlors around Wall Street were sending in pizzas that were sent in. You know, people would put in orders from Egypt, from Wisconsin, to support the occupiers. They called the pizza pies Occupies, and they used every part of them, right? They ate the pizzas, and they used the boxes for signs. When there was this freak snowstorm in October, you know, climate change I'm not going to get into tonight, but that's a healthcare issue as well. They removed all the signs except for one, hell snow, we won't go. But usually they had many signs out, and people would carry these signs that said things like, we'll believe corporations are people when Texas executes one. But this idea of this moment in time and the power of corporations, and how this has been a challenge in our country from way back. Go back a century ago. Dennis and I just wrote this column on Russ Feingold, you know, the defeated senator in Wisconsin, who has now been named one of the 35 co-chairs of Obama's re-election campaign. Very interesting, because the day he was named this last week, Russ Feingold came into Democracy Now! Studios for an interview. And we went to the homepage of his website. He runs a PAC now called Progressives United. And across the top of his website. It said, "The president is wrong." Those 4 words headlined the website of Progressives United, founded by Obama campaign advisor Russ Feingold. He's referring to Obama's recent announcement that he'll accept super PAC funds for his re-election campaign. Feingold writes, "The president is wrong to embrace the corrupt corporate politics of Citizens United through the use of super PACs, organizations that raise unlimited amounts of money from corporations and the richest individuals, sometimes in total secrecy. It's not just bad policy, it's also dumb strategy." He says it's dancing with the devil. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt said to Congress, "All contributions by corporations to any political committee or for any political purpose should be forbidden by law." He signed a bill into law banning such contributions in 1907. In 2012, this 100-year history of campaign finance controls died thanks to 5 U.S. Supreme Court justices who decided in the 2010 Citizens United case that corporations can use their money to express free speech, most notably in their efforts to influence federal elections. This fundamentally is what has to shift in this country. And I think with the super PACs, with this undisclosed money, President Obama says he's going to raise more than $1 billion. And that's the Democrat in the presidential race. The Obama campaign it is said that they are going to raise more than $1 billion. How do you think, if that is just allowed to go on, unfettered, if the American people allow this to happen, how do you think we're going to fare when it comes to issues like health care? When you have this massive amount of money, we don't know from whom, coming from the drug industry, coming from the insurance industry, coming from the oil, the gas, the coal industry, coming from the weapons manufacturers, and yet still, it's ultimately your voices that make the difference. There is a force more powerful. And it is all of you in this room, joining with people all over this country, who make a decision about the course that we want our country to take. This is a pivotal moment. The Democracy Now! Team was at Occupy Wall Street, at Zuccotti Park, at Liberty Park, when the police dismantled it and arrested many of the people inside. It was like 3, 4 in the morning. There was a library of more than 5,000 books. Patti Smith provided a tent for it. The great singer who is famous for "People Have the Power," which is so true. And they got rid of everything, the police. They destroyed everything. They brought together, and it was a great shame to the union activists, they brought in the sanitation workers, and together they just dismantled this encampment, bringing in dozens of sanitation trucks and dumping everyone's belongings and the entire library into this. When we got to the site, we were able to creep through the police line, and I picked up the one book that was left, believe it or not, on the ground of Zuccotti Park, and I still have it. Brave New World Revisited by Aldous Huxley. Tiny little paperback, old book. His nonfiction response to the speed with which he saw modern society careening to a very bleak future. To say the least, it seemed very relevant, as the encampment, motivated in large part by the opposition to the supremacy of commerce and globalization, was being destroyed. Huxley wrote in this book, "Big business, made possible by advancing technology and the consequent ruin of little business, is controlled by the state, that is to say, by a small group of party leaders and the soldiers, policemen, and civil servants who carry out their orders." Huxley writes, "In a capitalist democracy such as the United States, it is controlled by what Professor C. Wright Mills has called the power elite. This power elite directly employs several millions of the country's working force in its factories, offices, and stores, controls many millions more by lending them the money to buy its products, and through its ownership of the media of mass communication, influences the thoughts, the feelings, and the actions of virtually everybody." We can change this, but we have to challenge this power that does not serve the best of what democracy represents. You know, Sharif Abdel-Qaddous, my colleague who's now reporting for us in Cairo, and Nicole Salazar, who was our multimedia producer, and I were arrested 2 years ago at the Republican convention. And rather almost 4 years ago, in 2008. And I'm going to end with the story because I think all of this has to be challenged. Dissent is what's going to save us in this country. But we were covering the first day of the convention. We'd just come from the major protests at the Democratic Convention where people were marching against war and poverty in the streets of Denver. And we flew into Minneapolis. It was Labor Day, the first day of the convention. You know, Sarah Palin had just been announced as the vice presidential candidate with John McCain. And 10,000 people marched for peace. It was this beautiful blue sky morning. Maybe some of you were there, from St. Paul City Hall to the Excel Center. And they were led by soldiers. You know, the Occupy movement's a big untold story. So many soldiers and returning soldiers are part of the Occupy movement. You know, I was in Louisville covering the encampment there. I went there. It was right in front of the prison. All these guys came out of tents. It was midnight. I was giving a talk, and I wanted to see and talk to the folks at the encampment, and I went there. And the first guy who came out was a veteran of the Persian Gulf War. Second guy who came out of a tent had just been in Iraq from 2008 to 2010. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, I served my country there, and now I'm serving my country here." And when I told that story a few weeks later, someone said, no, he should have said, "I was serving the 1% in Iraq, and now I'm serving the 99% here." But the protest was led by soldiers, some who had refused to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, others who had fought and came back and felt that it was wrong, and some of them were wearing full military regalia, and they were very brave to do this. But then there were thousands of people, a cross-section of society, who marched, who came to St. Paul to march and express their views, and we covered that. And then I went to the floor of the convention center to interview delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. And Sharif and Nicole went off to digitize tape at Democracy Now! In the TV studio we were working out of. And then I got a call from Mike Burke, our senior producer, "Come quickly to 7th and Jackson. Sharif and Nicole have been arrested and they've been bloodied by the police." I said, "What are you talking about?" They were in the studio digitizing tape. I raced off the floor of the convention with Rick Rowley, great filmmaker with Big Noise Films. We raced to the streets of St. Paul, got to 7th and Jackson. The riot police had fully surrounded the area. It was fully contained. I raced up to the police, and I said, "Excuse me, I've just come from the convention. I'm wearing all the top security credentials that allow me to interview presidents and vice presidents. It's their credentials. It's the state authorities who give us these credentials." And I said, "You can see I'm fully credentialed. I have 2 colleagues inside. They're credentialed like I am. We need to have them released." It wasn't seconds before they ripped me through that line, twisted my arms back, slapped the handcuffs on, threw me against the wall onto the ground. And they charged me with interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. I'm desperately looking for Nicole and Sharif. I can't see Nicole anywhere, but I see Sharif across the parking lot, his hands behind his back. I demand to be brought to him. They finally bring me to him. We're both standing there. His arm has been bloodied, and we've got our credentials on. We're shouting, "You must release us. You see that we're journalists. You must release us," whereupon the Secret Service came and ripped the credentials from around our necks. So then I was taken into a police van to be taken off to jail, and there was Nicole. Her face was bloodied, she had her credentials on, and she was handcuffed. She quickly told me what had happened. She said they were digitizing tape, they heard a commotion outside. They wouldn't have been doing their job if they hadn't grabbed camera and microphone and raced downstairs. There were police, there were protesters, there was this parking lot. Nicole started filming, and the riot police were coming at her, shouting, on your face, and move." She said, "Where?" She was against the cars. And they shout, on your face, and she didn't even know what hit her. From in front of her and behind, they took her down on her face. Her camera tumbled down, and the first thing they did was take the battery out of the camera, if you were wondering what they wanted to stop happening.
She is on the ground, on her face. They've got knee or boot in her back. They're pulling on her leg, and so they're bloodying her face. Sharif is a very cool guy. I mean, he dealt with this entire Egyptian revolution, but that was in the years to come. But he was as cool then. And he's telling the rioting police to calm down. And they take him, and they throw him up against the wall. They kick him twice in the chest. They bloody his arm, and they take him down. Nicole and I was taken to the police garage where they'd erected cages to put the protesters in. And Nicole and Sharif were taken to jail. They face felony riot charges. It was because the video of our arrests went online. Independent filmmakers put it up online. It went viral, the most watched video of the first 2 days of the Republican convention. But that night, just after a few hours, there was such a response. Thousands of people called in, tweeted in, faxed in, emailed in to release us that we were released. I got out first, then Sharif got out. He was in jail in a cell with the AP photographer. He was released before the AP photographer, and Nicole was released. I was taken to the convention center. I went up into the NBC skybox, and networks wanted to interview me. I told the story. When the camera was shut down, the NBC reporter came over to me and said, "I don't get it. Why wasn't I arrested?" So I said, "Oh, were you covering the protest outside?" I mean, mind you, these are healthcare activists, these are doctors, these are students who are protesting, these are soldiers who are protesting, these are nurses who are protesting. This is, you know, America that's outside. And I said, were you out covering the protest too? You know, more than 40 reporters were arrested. And he said, "No." So I said, "Oh, well, I'm not getting arrested in the skybox either." I mean, as Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. You've got to get out there. And, you know, it's really a very important point. We have to get on the convention floor, cover these protests, cover the convention. We got to get into the corporate suites. Who is sponsoring the Republican Governors Association, you know, the Koch brothers? Who's covering the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee? We got to get into these rooms where they're serving the hors d'oeuvres. I don't know how many little crabs and shrimps I reached for to say, "Oh, and who bought these?" And getting the doors slammed on me every time. That's our job, too. Going from the convention floor to the suites to the streets, where the thousands of uninvited guests are, who also have something very important to say. You know, democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we try to put things on the record. So the next day, as we continued to cover the convention, the police chief held a news conference announcing how proud he was of the police actions so far. So I went into actually the policeman who opened the door to the press conference was my processing officer the night before. And I said, "You not only have to let me in this news conference, you have to let me out when it's done." So I went in and I said, you know, the reporters were asking questions. I raised my hand and I said to Chief Harrington, "I want to know what have you instructed your police to do? And how do you expect us to operate in this atmosphere?" And I described the bloodying of Sharif and Nicole, their arrests as well as my own. And he responded, "If we wanted to operate in St. Paul, we could embed with the mobile field force. Embed with the police mobile field force." You know, the next day I saw a Fox reporter with his, you know, baseball cap on Fox, and he's moving in the middle of this mobile field force. They're moving like one organism through the streets. You know what they're saying. You know, embed. It's like embedding in the troops in the front lines of Iraq and Afghanistan. I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. I mean, the Pentagon calls it a spectacular success, which is precisely why the media has failed so miserably. We should not only not be embedding with the troops in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, and if we are, it has to be embedding with in the hospitals of Iraq, in the communities of Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen, with the peace movement around the world, to understand the full implications and ramifications of war. We need an independent media, not embedding in the troops or not embedding in the establishment in Washington. There is a reason why the media is so important, and why ultimately I think it is a free media, an independent media, that will save us. I'll just end on this word, static. My brother and I, a few years ago, wrote a book called Static. And the reason we call it that, and as we move into these next conventions, it is absolutely imperative that, and as we move in, Dr. Young comes from Chicago, where Rahm Emanuel, the former chief of staff of Obama, is now the mayor, and he's going to be dealing with, and everyone in Chicago is going to be dealing with the NATO meeting that's going to be happening in May, and there's a very serious crackdown that is already underway in Chicago preparing for this. By the way, I didn't mention that we sued the St. Paul, Minneapolis police. And 3 years later, we have just won a major settlement. And we announced the settlement at Occupy Wall Street before it had been dismantled, because we felt it was critical, as police are tear gassing and arresting protesters around this country and arresting journalists, that we send a message that it is not acceptable to go after the messenger. No illegal arrests are acceptable. But when they target journalists, what we won, in addition to a monetary settlement, not only, and this is pretty unprecedented, from the police of the Twin Cities, but also from the Secret Service, which wanted from the beginning to be taken out of this suit, and we would not remove them from the suit. Interestingly enough, the police were so upset, the police that were dealing with us, when I said, how dare the police take these credentials from us, they wanted to separate themselves. They said that they were the ones who told us it was the Secret Service. Said, that's not us, that's the Secret Service, because the Secret Service first denied they had anything to do with this. So we won it from both the Secret Service and the police, but also, as important, we won an agreement from the St. Paul Police that they would develop with the Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU and us a protocol for dealing with journalists. We are moving into the conventions in Charlotte and Tampa. There are going to be mass gatherings there. As we see all over this country, there are mass gatherings. And we have to ensure, and this is all of our responsibility, that the police stop treating dissent as if it is the enemy. I don't think all police feel this way at all. Look at the police in Wisconsin, who together with the firefighters protected the nurses and the teachers. They slept with, in the Capitol, the protesters to protect them. They said, even if the governor is not targeting us, if they are targeting teachers and nurses, and protesters, then we see that they are targeting us. And that's a different model that we see. And that is a model that will ultimately protect us and serve us and strengthen a democracy. My brother and I wrote this book called Static, and the reason we titled it that is because in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static. This veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths, when what we need is the media to give us the dictionary definition of static, and that is criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements, like the healthcare movement in this country, like the movement for equality in this country, the movement against war and torture in this country. We need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Democracy Now!
want to do your book signing?
Yeah, I mean, it's only a few bucks, but I'll be outside.